ready now.
He says he's ready now. You ready? Hello and welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar from Purdue University. Our speaker today is Dr. Fariborz Faramund. He received his PhD in Information and Computer Science from Georgia Tech, and he is a faculty fellow and research assistant professor here at CERIAS at Purdue University. Dr. Faramund has received several awards for excellence in scholarship and education, including a fellowship from the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection. His research interests are in behavioral economics and its applications in information systems, security and privacy of information systems, vulnerability and risk assessment for information systems, and technology policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Faramund.
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Rasmus. It's a pleasure to be here again in this semester. The topic of our class is on understanding insiders, and how they take risk, looking at insiders from a behavioral perspective, risk behavioral perspective. The presentation that you're going to see today is some of the results of a collaborative research that Purdue had with the I3P. I3P stands for Institution for Information Infrastructure Protection, and some other institutions across the country, like Cornell University, like Columbia, Rand Corporation, and MITRE, and Indiana University. If you need any further information about this lecture, you're more than welcome to send me emails at fariborz@purdue.edu, which is my first name, fariborz@purdue.edu. And you also have access to the article that Professor Spafford and I wrote with the same topic. The paper had been published by Information System Frontiers. It's a journal which is published by Stringer Publication. It's going to be on hard copy sometime this year, but it's already available online. And I believe that computer scientists, you are more comfortable with looking at the paper online. So it's already there. Just go and check on the link and you see the whole paper. Today's presentation has 5 parts. I start with giving background and motivation about the research, who is an insider and how we started this research, how insiders perception of risk, how insiders frame decisions, and I end the presentation with conclusions and recommendations. But who is an insider? And this is a very interesting question. Why? Because we all hear about insiders doing different things in organizations. And there have been lots of research already on insider behavior. And believe it or not, after all this research that we have done and all these incidents that we had experienced from insiders, which tell us the threat of insider is very real, we still don't have a commonly accepted definition for insider. So, and that tells you, yes, please come in. And that tells you how much room we have, and for you guys as a graduate student, to do research on this topic, just from the A of the alphabet. Who's an insider? I have found many various definitions for insider. The first one, the one that we all love as computer scientists, we are binary people. We love everything to be translated into 0 and 1. So that's the way we define insider. Insider, a person is either an insider or not. We define an insider as a binary condition. Insider, not insider. That's it. There's an organizational perspective. on insiders, who insiders are. They define insiders based on the status of their employment. How long have they been employed? Where have been they employed at? What do they do? What is their role in their organization? And that kind of question. So it goes on and on. But there are some problems with the definitions which has caused a disagreement on acceptance of one definition for the insider. For example, if being in an organization, being physically located in the organization is the definition, then how about all of the employees who are remotely connected to their networks? We know people who are working for different places, they don't even need to go to the place. They're just connected to their employees. They don't even go there to pick up their paychecks. It's going to be mailed to them or it's going to be deposited online, their accounts. That kind of thing. There are people who have not met their bosses yet. So are these people inside or not? So this is the kind of problem that we have for the top two definitions of insider. But at the end of the day, we have to have a definition. We have to follow one and we go with it. So the one that we accepted for our research is the one that was presented by Matt Bishop. You may know Matt by his book, textbook on computer security. He has done some research on insiders, and he's defining insiders based on their access attributes. And he maps these access attributes to the organization. So versus the previous definitions, which defined a perimeter, that are you in the perimeter or not, he defined these access attributes to the person and the kind of threats that he can cause is correlated with his access rights. So the more access you have, the better, the more important insider you are. So that is the definition that we have adopted for this research. So regardless of you accept Bishop's definition of insider or not, they are real and they are doing all different things with their access rights. So we are facing the risk of insiders. So we have risk, then we have to have formal risk assessment models. And we have to have decision support tools. We have to make decisions on how to confront the insider threat. We have to assess them, we have to mitigate them. But how can we do that? I spoke briefly about this problem last time, about doing risk management in information security, which is our field. To do a very simple risk analysis, as it is defined today as risk analysis, you need to have two elements, two very basic elements. One is the likelihood, the probability of the incident to occur. And the other one is the consequence. For any risk assessment that you want to do today, as is defined as risk analysis by engineers and by scientists, you must have these two elements. If you don't have it and you're doing something, then that thing is not the risk assessment as it's known by engineers. So we don't have that data. We don't have these two elements for insiders. Why? Because if something happens bad in an organization, the manager decides if not to release the information unless they have to. So we really don't know what is happening. So we don't have an accurate statistics of the incidents caused by insiders and the consequence of what they did. So the traditional way of doing risk analysis does not simply work in the case of insiders. So we need to have alternatives. The second part of talking about perception, which is a different school of thought. People who started this school of thought actually started this research around 40 years ago, and they are known as decision scientists. They argue, and they have strong evidences for their arguments, that even if you have these statistics, even if you have this data from the past, people are still, you have to understand that decision making is not that easy. It's not based on the statistics all the time. People are not looking at just the numbers and make decisions. It's not as simple as we think it is. It's not as simple as we model sometimes in our research. Most of the assumptions that we make about the rational actor, the decision scientists argue, and they present evidences, undeniable evidences actually, that it doesn't work in the real world. It looks good on the paper. We can write beautiful equations, we can publish papers, great papers, but the real world is different. So they argue that most of the decisions that people make today are based on perception of risk instead of statistical risk as feeling versus risk analysis. So what is perception of risk? This is a definition that I like from Slovik. Slovik is one of those people that I mentioned started this research decades ago. And he practically says perception of risk is about intuitive risk judgments. So instead of looking at the real numbers, real statistics, people rely on their intuitions to make decisions. And we have to understand this perception. Why? Because perceptions lead to intuitive thinking, and intuitive thinking leads to reasoning. And this is from Daniel Kahneman, one of my favorites, one of the scientists who has inspired my research. And I borrowed this concept from his Nobel lecture in 2002. That's how he describes the importance of perceptions. So we have to understand how insiders, in order to understand how insiders take risk and they commit all those different bad things, we have to understand how they perceive risks. I briefly described this model last time in my last lecture, that Fischoff and Slovik and their colleagues, they developed 9 dimensions for perceptions of technology risks. They started this research by around on 78 actually, over 3 decades ago, when nuclear power plant, building nuclear power plant with a great deal, which it still is today, but they were trying to look at how people react, how lay people react to this dimension of risk of nuclear power plants. So they developed 9 dimensions for perception of risk. I like these 9 dimensions. I have used it in different research projects that I had, and it has been widely used. For example, it has been adopted by UK standards, by Her Majesty's Treasury in UK in assessing public risks. So internationally recognized. So the 9 dimensions is starts with voluntariness, and we can apply that to perception of risk of insiders. If the insider get to that action voluntarily, it's different from if he doesn't get there voluntarily, if he gets forced. If he gets voluntarily involved in that action, he perceived less risk. Immediacy of effect. How immediate are the effect of getting involved in that situation? If the insider perceives that something is going to happen right there, at that time or in a short time, it makes a difference in his perception of risk versus the situation that he perceives something is going to happen, but not today, in a later time. That makes a difference. So immediacy of effect is one dimension of perception of risk. Knowledge about the risk. How much the insider knows about the risk. Does he know what the heck he's doing or not? If he knows, he perceives less risk. If he doesn't, he perceives more. Knowledge to science is the fourth dimension of the perception of risk. How much this risk of this activity is known to the science anyway. That makes a difference. Control is an important factor. I gave the example of sitting in the plane to travel or sitting in the car last time. Briefly, if you look at the statistics, the number of the people who get killed or injured in the plane crashes is almost zero versus the number of the people who get killed in the car accidents. But people perceive taking plane riskier than taking the car. Why? One reason is because they have control over driving. So because they have control, they perceive less risk. It's the same thing for an insider. If they control the activity, they perceive less risk. And it goes on and on how catastrophic is, what is the magnitude of the bad things which could happen to the insider by his action. How new is this activity? How common it is? And how severe are the consequences? So these 9 dimensions are Fishoff's original analog dimensions of risk. Any questions so far? No? All clear? Crystal clear? Good. So, the third part of the talk is our risk perception of model. You know, as scientists, as engineers, as researchers, we just love to look at previous research and revise it. We just love doing this. We have done this for a long time, and I don't think we're going to stop it. So that's what we did at Purdue. We looked at the previous research by Fishoff and Slovic and their colleagues, and we kind of revised it. First of all, prior to us, there were some researchers who argued, I guess, by the accuracy of 80%, around that, 75% or 80%. Those 9 dimensions presented by Fishoff and Slovic can be condensed into 2 dimensions. So we said those 2 dimensions are understanding of risk and the consequence of risk. So 9 dimensions to 2 dimensions with 85% accuracy. Then we argued that the perception of risk is not static. It's dynamic. Why? Because your knowledge of risk is under change. The way you look at things today is different from the way you used to look at things 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. So we need a time dimension to include in understanding risk perception. So the integral is referring to the time element, time 0 to time 1. So, and so this is the revised model. Again, there's some more information. I want to spend my time on explaining other things, experimental results. So if you can see more in the paper about this model. One other thing that we did for this model is we introduced metrics. We introduced different levels for this perception of risk. We introduced 5 levels for the consequence dimension, starting from level 1 to 5, which level 1 is a lower consequence and level 5 is a higher consequence. If you're in level 1, we perceive that the effects of the actions are temporary, versus If you're in level 5, you perceive that the effects are catastrophic. They're very bad. They're huge. So these 5 levels are for the consequence dimension. Then we introduce 6 levels for the understanding dimensions. The understanding dimension works opposite to the consequence. You see the arrow is going opposite way in consequence and understanding. Why? Because they work different way. If you understand more, you perceive less risk. Versus, if you feel more consequence, you perceive higher risk. That is a positive correlation. But for understanding, it's lower. So that is the way we introduce these levels to the original model by Fisher and Slovic. And of course, we love to test our models. So we started interviewing, 42, I hope I'm right, 42, I call it information security executives from private agencies to different departments, to law enforcement agencies. We presented this model with a brief introduction, it's like 10-minute introduction, that this is what we're doing, and this is our model. Can you map your experiences with insiders into this model? The great thing was, yes, we can do this. So this paragraph, all in italic, is the exact code of describing an experience that a law enforcement agent had with an insider. So he was able to say, yes, I remember this. This is the worst thing which could happen in my life. I define this incident as an insider incident, and this is what happened at that time. People understanding level was this. After some time, the understanding of people were changed to this level. The same thing for consequence. He was able to map his experience to our risk perception model. So that was a great news for us as researchers, that we developed a model that people actually can use, at least on that scale, with 10 minutes of introduction. But you always learn from people. You always learn when you interview. There were many valuable lessons learned during the interviews with these information security executives. And I highlighted the first, I call the top 3 lessons that we learned from executives. That, hey, it's not just a perception of risk which you should look for. You just don't look at the risk because you want to know what the risk is. You want to manage the risk. You want to respond to the risk. You want to see how people work with this risk. The common comment that we get from these 42 executives was, it's actually perceived benefit, which is interplaying with perceived risk. And it has lots of influence on decision making of insiders. So perception of risk, as we described, is not static, it's dynamic. One factor that highly influences the perception of risk is the perception of benefit. It outweighs it. It lowers the perception of risk. And I'm going to give you an example. This is for educational purposes. So do not do it, just to get the concept. Assume somebody is standing in the second floor of, how many of you go to Lawson? Here we go. Let's say somebody is standing in the second floor of the Lawson. And says, I want somebody to jump of the second floor. If he does such a thing, how do you think people are going to react? They're going to laugh at him. Or he may get lucky if nobody calls. Say, how this guy has some mental problems, perhaps. Why he's doing this here? What is he doing here? Why he wants us to jump off the floor, of the second floor? Now, consider the scenario that person said, I want somebody to jump off the second floor, but this is $100 cash, and he put it right on the table. People may react differently. Scenario number 3. If you said, I want somebody jumped off the second floor, this is $1,000 cash. People are going to react again differently. People are going to look at it. If he gets to 5,000 or 10,000, I bet there will be some people who are standing over there. So this is the real world example. Again, this is for educational purposes. This is not for use in the real world, just for you to get the concept that how perceived benefit interplays with perceived risk. What happened is, in the 3 scenarios which could happen in a time difference of 3 minutes, there was no change on the elevation of the second floor of the law firm building, or there was no change on the strength of the body of the people who were walking around that building. If people were jumping like 3 minutes ago, it would have made no difference on their bodies versus after 3 minutes. What made the difference? That people started listening or actually willing to do that thing was looking at the cash, looking at the benefit. So this is perceived risk versus perceived benefit. And interestingly enough, this concept is a very important concept, which is known as the inverse relationship between risk and benefit, was discovered by decision scientists around 20 years ago. Unsurprisingly, have not been adopted by many economists. So many economic models that we see today are ignoring this assumption, and I'll get to it later on during this talk. So that was one valuable lesson that we got. A second was near miss. Have anybody heard of near miss incidents? What is near miss incidents? Any idea? Any suggestion?
You barely escape an accident.
Yes! Think exactly. Things which should have happened, but they didn't happen. We learned that these incidents are going to highly influence the behavior of the insiders. Most of the insiders who were caught, they were not doing that thing for the first time. And they were not doing that big thing for the first time. They started by little things. They didn't get caught, so they thought it's not going to happen. It's syndrome that I call it, or others call it, and I love that name. It won't happen to me syndrome. That it's going to happen to others, not to me. And the third lesson was, there are models in the real world used by executives and by law enforcement agents in modeling insider behavior. One model that we learned from our case studies was fraud triangle. It has 3 elements: opportunity, pressure, and rationalization, which the way described is as follows. The insider looks at an opportunity, sees an opportunity, and he's under pressure. So he or she rationalizes his behavior. Then he commits a crime. This is the way that many organizations are looking at insider crime. And it was presented by Charles Wells, and this is a 2005 article that has been cited here for further information. Okay. Fourth part of the talk, framing insider decisions. So, We learned about perception of risk. We learned about perception of benefit. Then at the end of the day, we are scientists, we're engineers. We are researchers. We want to publish papers. We want to model things. We want to have some scientific base for our analysis, for our presentation. We like to model things. We have to be able to frame these decisions. We have to be able to present it in a framework. So one lesson that we learned was the traditional methods of decision analysis, engineering analysis, expected utility decisions. And utility, by utility, I'm not talking about the gas bill. It's utility analysis, utility of a value of a gamble, for example. They have a problem to be applied to modeling behavior of insiders. They both rely on the assumption of rationality, which is totally against what we saw, that perception of risk and perception of benefit. Risk and benefit are positively correlated. The more risk, the more benefit. More risk, the more benefit. It's linear like this. That's how expected utility works. That's how economic models, at least most of them, work. If it's a rational actor, perceived high risk, it perceives higher benefit. But it doesn't work that way. There's an interplay between perceived benefit and perceived risk. So this is a very fundamental assumption of classical decision theory. So we are not able to use it in our model. And there are other problems that the decision insiders make their decisions based on the change of the wealth, not the total wealth. What does that mean in a real world? If 500, let's say, or $50 discount, is it a good discount or not? Well, the answer, it depends. Depends, exactly, it depends. Some places, $50 is a great discount. You want to buy a book, the book is $120, and you get $50 discount. It's awesome. But you want to buy a car, it's $5,000 car, $50, you start laughing, this is not a discount. I mean, I'm serious. So that's how insiders make decisions too. It's based on the change of the wealth, not the total wealth, not based on the total gain, which is a concept which cannot be easily described by expected utility function. So, what should we do? We came up with the field of behavioral economics, which was founded by Kahneman. You already know how Kahneman looks like in my earlier slides in his Nobel talk in 2002. Kahneman and Tversky, they proposed a theory called prospect theory in early 70s, which is I heard many interesting stories about the prospect theory being published at that time. Tversky and Kahneman are both psychologists, and they presented prospect theory for the first time in early 70s in Econometrics, which is a journal of in the field of economics. Many colleagues said if they had published that paper in another psychology journal, most likely it would not have received the attention that it got today. Many people would have said, hey, it's just another theory in psychology. But today, it's one of the most well-known economic theories that we know. It's based on not assuming that people are always behaving rational, and this was one of the things that we liked. It has two faces. It's not similar to the traditional expected utility models that say, this is the value, this is the likelihood. Boom, this is the expected gain. It doesn't work that way. It has two stages. It frames the decision in two stages, which we applied. And interestingly enough, we explained this model for the executives in a simple language. And they understood it very well. And they adopted. So we claim that prospect theory may be used in describing insider behavior. Prospect theory has two phases. One is framing phase. At the first phase, the insider constructs a representation of facts, of acts, contingencies, and outcomes. At the valuation phase, the insider assesses the value of each prospect. So the first time he frame, then it value. The great thing with prospect theory is it's not just text. It can be shown by symbols. We can model it. And this is how the value function looks like on the left side. As you see, it's not straight line, it's S-shape, which can describe many, I call it anomalies of human behavior, risk averse, which we don't have time to go to in details, but there's more description in the paper. So the other great thing with this theory was it's quantitative. We can show it by equations. So we adopted this theory, prospect theory, and it worked very well. The last part of the talk, always conclusion and recommendations. So, after 2 years of research in this project, these are some of the conclusions and recommendations that we have. If you want to make effective decisions to confront insider threats, we have to understand their behavior. They are not programmable. They are humans. They take risks. And if you want to understand how they behave, we have to understand their risk-taking behavior. We have to understand how they perceive risk. What is their perception of risk? And we hope the model that we presented can help organizations as a decision assisting tool for measuring perceptions of risk by insiders. Technical countermeasures remain to be extremely important in detecting insider. We have this great field of intrusion detection. We have to have it. We have to work hard on it. But we have to also understand the human aspect of the insider behavior. Remember, it's not just binary in the real world. It's binary in our machine. In the real world, it's different. How can we reduce insider threats? These are some recommendations that we have. We argue that if we can help the insider to understand the risk of detection, we can reduce the insider threat. Back to that "it won't happen to me" syndrome. If we can help the people in our organizations that it actually may happen, it actually have happened to many people to get caught, the risk of doing bad things will be lower. How can we achieve this? We can start educating employees. And we can have proactive detection policies. Proactive versus reactive. Meaning, don't wait for something bad to happen. Try to look at it in advance. This is something that we have to have for policy. The worst thing that we can do to an incident is we just wait for it to happen, then we start thinking of how can we prevent it, or what should we do with it. We have to have policies in place, and they have to be proactive. The insiders may ask two questions. Will I get caught? First. And second is, what is the punishment? If they understand, the answer to its first question is yes. Yes, you will get caught. there's a very high chance that you get caught. The likelihood that they think of the second stage and the punishment would go down. Second thing is creating a fair environment. One common comment that we heard from these executives, information security executives, which was consistent with the literature review, was majority, not all, majority of the insiders who have done all the different things in organizations somehow were unhappy for some reasons. And these problems were not addressed. We can help reducing the threat by addressing this very important part, that they have how they're perceiving things. Are they perceiving themselves as an insider? Are they perceiving that they're being treated fairly or not? If they don't feel that they're being treated fairly for any reason, that is the beginning of thinking, doing things that we hear in media. Social scientists call it social exchange perceptions. These are important concepts that management in organizations should consider. And of course, their perception of risk, how their employees are perceiving good things and bad things, and what are the perception of risk. And that's it. This is the conclusion and the recommendation. Any question? All clear? Crystal clear? Okay. If you have any question, you know how to reach me. fattyboard@purdue.edu. We also have the paper available online, which is on the homepage of CERIAS and the seminar. And feel free to contact us, but please, before you leave, you make sure that you're going to fill this form. Thank you.